Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight and coming to see the Bishop. And it is great to have you in the house, Bishop. Thank you for making time. I know that you and the cabinet have been meeting today and tomorrow, and it's a long day for you all. But we really appreciate you coming across the mountain to be with us. And so I had reached out to the Bishop a couple of months ago and had asked him to come and visit. Dip Clifford and I were talking about Reimagine, which you heard a lot about yesterday. And it was largely inspired by comments that the Bishop's been making the last 2 years at annual conference and other places that I've seen you and Deb has seen you. And so what we thought was that it would be great for you to hear some of what we've heard from the Bishop about his thoughts on where we need to be moving as a church, both as a conference and as Simsbury. And we kind of sat and talked one night and said, well, you know, the best person to talk about what the Bishop has to say is the Bishop. So why don't we just invite the Bishop? So we did. And initially it looked like we were not going to be able to get you until January or February. And of course, that's crazy now too. And so I saw the Bishop a few weeks ago at an event, and he said, you need to call Pam, my assistant. She's got some dates and some times that may work. And so here we are. So thank you very much for doing this. And as for me, I would still love to hear some of those thoughts that you have about, you know, where we're headed as the church. The last sermon that I heard you preach at the ordination service, you talked about canoeing the mountains, and I thought it was powerful. And so we have just, we spent yesterday in this room hearing a presentation about reimagining church and how do we move beyond what we're doing here and out into the community. And what I would say in my very short 4 months here is that you have a church with a huge amount of strengths, and they are negotiating and looking to leverage those strengths to do more instead of just continuing to do what they've done, maintaining what they're doing and reaching out and doing more. And I couldn't be happier with that. So that's kind of where I'm at. And so I'd love to just kind of turn the microphone over to you and the room over to you and these wonderful people who have come out tonight to see you. So thank you. I'd be happy to. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this time and this space. Thank you for the history of this church, the journey that you have walked with people that have gone before us. And God, I pray that the journey that you have laid out before us and that we will all walk together is one that is filled with fruit and wonder, filled with hard work, great successes, and even moments of trial, because trial can bring us closer together, God. And so I thank Bishop Bickerton for coming out tonight. I thank Reverend D.S. Alfred Sylvester for coming with him to be with us also. And I pray that this would be a wonderful time where we are challenged and uplifted so that we are ready to do the work that you have laid before us. God, we pray knowing that the people in Pittsburgh are in sorrow tonight, that they are struggling to make sense of what has happened in that community. And Lord, so many of us in this community and communities around the nation are doing the same. And so our thoughts and our prayers are with them even as we gather here tonight. And so I pray in your name that all would be made well, that delivery would come from the hills that surround us here, and that you would come to be with us in moments of joy and in those moments of sorrow. I pray all of this in your name. Amen.
Thanks, Gene. Good evening, everybody. Oh, that was not very good. Good evening. Nice to see you. This is really a free-flowing evening. I have very little prepared, and if there was anything that I prepared, it probably would have changed given the events of yesterday. Some of you may know that I spent 12 years right there in Pittsburgh as the Bishop of Western Pennsylvania, and I've been past that synagogue dozens of times, and so it comes very close to home. And yet, I just wrote a piece. I don't know whether you've had a chance to read that or not. It was sent out yesterday. The thing that sobered me was that it's just a series. It's one in a series, one in the latest. And, you know, confessionally, it's really hard for us to remember the last one or the one before that when the one that takes the front page dominates our minds. And so I began to recall over the weekend places like Texas and a high school in Florida and a small Baptist church in Charleston, South Carolina, and you know the list is just endless. And it gets me to thinking. I preached yesterday at Crawford Memorial in the Bronx, and I said to them in reflecting on the shooting in Pittsburgh that, we're very vulnerable sitting here today, that someone could choose this place at this hour to do a similar thing. And it causes a variety of different emotions to come to your mind. One of those is that it becomes harder for us to do the work that we're called to do, because that element of hesitancy and fear all of a sudden is in our consciousness. What if this is the hour? What if this is the time? Should I put myself in a vulnerable place to do what I'm called to do? And so it's a challenge. But the second piece that conjures up in my mind is that it's an opportunity. And it's one of the things that I've been particularly concerned about the church in recent years. And that is that we've kind of rolled over and played dead, if you will, with the message that we're called to proclaim. And without any political undertones intended, it's sobering for me to realize that our landscape is being dominated with a rhetoric that is defined with words like fear and anger and finger pointing and hatred and cynicism. And it doesn't matter where that's coming from. It seems to be coming from all angles these days. That those tend to be the kinds of words that are dominating the landscape. Fear, hatred, anger, cynicism, finger pointing, doubt. Now, I don't know what your pastor preached on yesterday, but if those were the 5 points in his sermon, my guess is that your new pastor will become your old pastor pretty soon, because we gather in a place like this, and our goal in gathering in a place like this is to bolster ourselves up for what we're called to do, and that bolstering happens when we hear and are encouraged by words like hope, peace, joy, faith. Yesterday I preached on the gospel lesson from the lectionary on the blind Bartimaeus. And if you know that story, Bartimaeus was in a community, and Jesus came into the community. Bartimaeus heard about Jesus coming, and he cried out to Jesus, have mercy on me. And Jesus, in effect, the guy was asking for healing. And in effect, Jesus said, I don't need to heal you. You have already healed yourself. You've healed yourself by your faith. And the scriptures say, and it's a very unique piece of scripture, that the scriptures say, and immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. And as I reflected on that passage yesterday, it was really striking to me to realize that there were any number of times that people asked Jesus for a favor, Jesus granted the favor, and you never hear about them again in Scripture. They never show up again. In fact, they don't show up even when Jesus is facing his most trying times. They're nowhere to be found. And so the whole driver of being in a place like this is not necessarily to come saying, Jesus, what are you going to do for me? But the real piece is to get the strength to be able to say, Jesus, what can I do for you? So we either have a gimme, 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 gimme kind of faith, or a give it, give it, give it, give it, give it kind of faith. And, it seems to me that we're in a day and a time when the rhetoric of the church is very, very needed. in our world. And so wherever I go, I'm talking to folks like you about how are you taking your witness to the streets? And how are you, in your own world, using the rhetoric that we talk about in church? How are you employing that rhetoric out there in the world? How are you engaging the public with a rhetoric that's far different than what you're hearing on Fox News or CNN or anything else that you're tuning into these days? And my longing is to mobilize the church around utilizing these gifts that we have to make a difference in the world. And so I find myself on a day like today thinking about what happened in Pittsburgh, and I think to myself, oh, it's gotten a little bit harder because we've gotten a little more hesitant because yet there's another shooting in another church. And yet, if we remain silent around those key pieces of our Christian faith that have given us a sense of hopefulness, then we'll never can expect to change anything in the world around us. If we become silent, we really become participants in that which we don't like. So, one of the things that always is a curiosity to me is about what is the motivation for a person to come to church. And quite frequently I hear people say, when I pose that question, folks will in effect in one form or another say, well, we come to church to get our battery charged. Well, that's good. But if that's the only component of that answer, it becomes a self-serving, what's in it for me kind of thing. So if I don't get what I need to get my battery charged in church, I'm going to go do something else. And when I think about getting my battery charged in church, the addition to that statement is I come to church to get my battery charged so that, there's the key words, so that I can go out into the world and discharge that battery, that energy, that motivation. Knowing, and that's a faith thing, it's a faith thing to discharge your battery because you give it away with the knowledge that you've got a place, namely Simsbury Church, to come and get your battery charged again. So you've got a power source that enables you to have the courage to discharge your battery in ways that will make a difference in the world. Now, I used to say when I was a young pastor living in southern West Virginia that my mission in life was to convert a toll booth operator on the West Virginia Turnpike. That was my mission. I said that jokingly for years. My mission in life is to convert a toll booth operator on the West Virginia Turnpike. Well, then all of a sudden a thing called Easy Pass came along, and there's no more toll booth operators. So I had to alter my mission a little bit. My mission today is a very simple one. If I can impact someone's life in some way every day of my life, then I believe my life will not be lived in vain. If I can impact someone's life every day of my life in some way, then I will have not lived my life in vain. Now let me give you an illustration. Alfred and I just got back from a 2-week trip where we took 90 people from the New York Annual Conference on a 2-week journey retracing the steps of Paul in Greece and Italy. And it was a magnificent opportunity. And we learned a lot. We grew together as a community as we traveled together, and it was really great. But I'm always looking for opportunities to live out my mission statement. If I can impact somebody's life in some way every day of my life, then my life's not lived in vain. So we checked into the airport in Rome the other day, and I enjoyed the 90 people. There was a point where I wanted just to have a little bit of space. So 90 people at gate 38 filled up every seat in the house. And because I fly quite a bit, I've got a perk or two. And one of those perks was I got access the other day to one of the clubs. So I thought, I'm not going to stand in line to get a cup of coffee, and I'm just going to go down to that club, and I'm going to get a piece of fruit and a cup of coffee, and I'm just going to have a little private time to myself for a couple minutes before we board this airplane. So I went down into that lounge, and I got my coffee, and I got my fruit, and I spent my little time, and it was really great. And it got about 20 minutes or so before boarding, and I got back on the elevator to go back up to the gate. Well, when the elevator door shut, there were 3 other people in the elevator with me. We pressed floor 2, but the elevator went to the basement, and the door wouldn't open. So we pressed another button, and the elevator went further into the bowels of the airport, and the door opened, and we thought, well, is this where we need to go? So one of the women went down the hall, and she opened a door, and the alarms just started going like crazy. So we rushed back into the elevator and pressed the button before someone came. We got up to level 2, and the door wouldn't open. And so I pressed 1, and it went down to 1, and the door wouldn't open. And I pressed 2, and it went back up to 2, and finally the door opened. Now, now it was getting to be really close to boarding time, and I had 3 other people in that elevator I'd never met before in my life, and they were really anxious. It was becoming very evident on their faces that they were very anxious. And I don't know what motivated me, but when the door opened, I said, I'm so glad we've had this time together, just to have a laugh and sing a song. And the one woman looked at me and went like this with the old clarinet line. And I got to the gate, and this woman looked at me. And she said, thank you. I was really afraid, and you made me laugh. And I'm so thankful that you came along at the right time. And so I started this conversation with her. And I said, you're on this flight? And she said, yes. And she said, could I ask you what you do? And so there's my, now I have my foot in the door. And I told her what I did. And she said, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. And I gave her my card, and I said, what do you do? And she said, well, I'm a professor at Columbia University in New York City, and I deal with aging and geriatric issues. So I gave her a little hug. She gave me a hug back. She had my card. I got home. In my inbox, there was a note from Evelyn, who said, I just can't believe how you enabled me to have a peaceful flight today. And if there's any way I can ever engage with you, I'd love to have that chance. And just so happens that I've got aging parents in Florida. And so I sent her an email back, and I said, yeah, you kind of made my day too with our conversation. And I said, kind of providentially, I'm having geriatric issues with my aging parents. And she sent me another email back and said, when you get a chance, contact me, and I'd love to talk with you about your mom and dad. Well, I don't know where that's going to go, but I can guarantee you one thing. If I hadn't opened my mouth and spontaneously sung a little song, it would have gone nowhere. It had gone nowhere. Now, I didn't realize that I was discharging my battery. But I was discharging my battery. And I didn't, on the elevator, think, oh, okay, here's an opportunity to touch somebody's life in some small way so that this day is chalked up as a worthwhile day in my life. I wasn't thinking about that. But I thank God that it just flowed. It just became an opportunity. Now, you know, when I was a kid growing up, there was this whole thing about evangelism and about how, you know, you approach someone and how you win someone for Jesus and how you convert a soul. And there was all that stuff, you know, and there were the invitations to come to the altar and give your life to Christ. And I still buy into some of that stuff. But I find myself in the 21st century kind of like you. It's a very different world. And the way in which we go about church in the 21st century, whether we like it or not, has got to be done differently. And in many respects, we have no idea how to do it. We've lost the art form of growing the church, and we've lost the handle on how do we talk about our faith to the point that we're almost paralyzed. And then you add something like what happened in Pittsburgh, and it further paralyzes us. And so you get real hesitant because you don't want to extend yourself because you don't know what's on the other side and how it might affect you. And yet, if that's our posture, we're dead in the water. You may as well just eventually close the doors of all of our churches and forget about it. But I'd like to employ what I call backdoor evangelism. And that is, it used to be that, you know, you would talk about Christ and invite people into that journey. But in the 21st century, I think you have to invite people into a journey. And when they say, oh, by the way, where did you get this? Or in my case, oh, by the way, what do you do? It then gives you a foot in the door to begin to talk about how my life has been impacted in a positive way because of my faith journey. A place where I come to talk about hope and peace and joy. And there is reason to believe in those things. And there's reason to believe that the world's a different place because of those things, or at least it can be. So I come to New York a couple years ago, and I encounter an annual conference that really doesn't have a sense of mission that we can clearly talk about. And so I've been spending a lot of time the last couple years talking about mission, vision, and core values. I think every church has got to have a clearly stated mission. What is our why? Why do we exist as a church? And then how do we exercise our why? In my recent history, I headed up our church's anti-malarial campaign. We raised $75 million to help in the cause of eradicating malaria across the world. And in my previous annual conference, I had, I've always talked a lot about the why. And I had a tiny little church that was just about ready to close. And I was in a meeting and I was talking about my stuff, and you never know what kind of seeds you plant. But these 4 ladies came up to me afterwards and said, we'd like to introduce you to our church. And I said, oh, I'd like to come sometime. She said, no, this is our church. It's the 4 of us. We'd like to introduce you to our church. And they said, we've been talking with the district superintendent about closing. But tonight, you've given us our why. Our why, we want our why to be malaria. And so their singular purpose in staying open was to raise money to help in the campaign to eliminate malaria across the world. They had a single why, but it was good enough to keep them open. And they're still open today with their singular why. I mean, they're the best malaria spokespersons I think I had in the entire campaign. So in the course of our work, this is our why in New York. We strive to share God's love by creating safe places where all are accepted and welcomed, connecting the needs of people to the presence of God, and transforming the world through Christ. Key words: creating, connecting, transforming. Now, in effect, that's exactly what I've been talking to you about the last 15 or 20 minutes. Creating an atmosphere where we can discharge our batteries with a rhetoric of grace and hope and faith and joy and love. Connecting with a world that's hearing anything but that in all of the ways that they encounter the world. I don't know how many horn honkers there are here. I live in New York. My life now is transformed by potholes and horns. And it makes me believe that brakes are optional and horns are mandatory on cars in New York. So I got to deal with a lot of nasty rhetoric all the time just living in New York. But connecting with the needs of people, with the belief that if we do, the world just might be a better place. Now, somebody says, well, what can I do? Well, the sky's the limit. And you don't have to bite off more than you could chew. What you can do might really just be to transform Simsbury. Or if that's too much, it might be transforming the grocery store. Or it might be transforming a person at a drive-through. That's in effect my favorite story. I went to give a speech one night, and when I got to the place at a camp, my speech was delayed, and I wasn't very happy about it because I had another meeting that night, and I wanted to go home and eat supper before I went to the next meeting. And they delayed my speech, so I hung around with a sour attitude, and I gave my speech, and I called home on the way down the highway, and I said, they've delayed my speech. I won't be home for supper. I'm just going to swing through this new Wendy's here in Spencer, West Virginia, and I'm going to get supper, and then I'm going to go on to Clendenin for my next speech. So I came to that drive-through, and you've been through those drive-throughs where you encounter the microphone, you know, the voice that sounds like Charlie Brown's mother, and the welcome to Wendy's kind of thing. And she said that, and I said, I want a chicken sandwich with lettuce, ketchup, and pickle, and a large Diet Coke. And I pulled up to the drive-thru, and I rolled down my window, and I grunted at that woman. And she kind of grunted at me, and I gave her my money, and she gave me my change, and I grunted at her, and she grunted at me, and I went on down the highway. About 5 miles down the highway, my nostrils kicked in, and I smelled absolutely nothing. Here I had paid that woman my money. She had given me change, and I was in such a foul mood, I left the restaurant without my bag of food. So it was then that I had a decision to make. Either my ego was going to win, and I was going to drive on to Clendenin, or my stomach was going to win, and I was going to go back and get my chicken sandwich. What do you think won? My stomach won. I turned around, went back to Wendy's, encountered Charlie Brown's mother again in the microphone. I said, in a minute, I pulled around, and I could see through the window there was a bag in the window and a drink, and that was my chicken sandwich in the window. So I pulled up, and I rolled down my window, and I looked at this young girl, and I pointed my finger at her, and I said, I've had a very bad day. And she pointed her finger right back at me and said, so did I until you came along. So did I until you came along. And we laughed. I must tell you that I have never seen that girl again in my life, but I live with her every day. I live with her every day because of that line. Did you hear her line? I was having a bad day, until you came along. And I wonder how many people are having a bad day in Simsbury waiting for somebody like you to come along. Someone who might sing a little song, give a little word, do a little simple, kind act that might cause them to say, where did you get that from? What do you do for a living? And you might then say, well, I got it at church. Because it's there where I bolster my life around kindness and joy and faithfulness and love. And I've learned how to do that because I'm a follower of Christ. And it might give you that chance to introduce something to someone who either might be a skeptic or a cynic or even unknowledgeable or unaware that there is a place where grace resides, a place where love grows, a place where we dream of a better world. Now, I think that's church. And I know it's in a culture that's very different. But I also know that it changed my life and probably changed yours. And if it changed us, why can't we dream of it changing the world around us? So that's kind of where we're going. The church has lots of systems and structures, and I'm equated with all those things. I'm equated with all of the business of the church, and I'm the bishop. But really, I'm Tom, a servant of Christ, and just trying to help us find our way into a posture of life and vitality in our churches. And I think the best way we do it is to be personal with one another. It's not created through lots of systems and structures. It's created when simple people like you and me get a conviction in their heart that God can use us to make the world a different place. And that's when real conversion happens, because all of a sudden you begin to sense, I can be a part of this. I'm not just a getter. I'm a giver. So that's my kind of off the cuff half hour with you. What do you want to talk about tonight? How do you respond to that? What floats your boat about that? Give me your name first.
Jan.
Hi, Jan.
Hi. I had an idea because I've been thinking, listening to the radio a lot today, and mulling over all that happened on Sunday. I came out of the nursing home and I saw the lights and police got scared because we've all got this on our mind. We're living with fear, right? And the police had blocked off the street, and I came down. What it was the synagogue's right there.
Uh-huh.
And there was a vigil on Sunday at that in Hartford, at West Hartford, at that synagogue. And so then I felt relieved, and I was pleased that they had the police. And then I listened to the different comments and things that I've listened to 5 hours today to NPR. And it occurred to me, putting that all together, that we do not need to be afraid
Nice.
A security guard with a gun, maybe they want to do that too, but we could go without our guns and be a very physical presence, and they could do that for us too. And I think we have a lot of cooperation in this community for that kind of program.
That's a nice idea. That's great. Yesterday in Pittsburgh, there were a series of Protestant churches that did not give their benediction in the sanctuary. They had a processional to the nearest synagogue, and they had their benediction circling the synagogue with Protestant people praying for the Jewish community. What a powerful symbol. Because, you know, we have, I've always looked upon ecumenism as we're all giving it our best shot to get to a preferred future. And none of us really, I mean, are you really, anybody in the room tonight, completely confident that the decisions you make are all right? Anybody? Until you talk to your wife. There you go. Okay. I mean, we're all just giving it our best shot to get down the road. And that means that we have different expressions. And it's not to say that one's wrong and another's right. It's just to say it's a different branch on the tree. We're all making it our best shot to try to get down the road. And if we approach, you know, different faith communities with an understanding that we're trying to do this together, even though we have some different expressions, we become community. And we become appreciative of the fact that maybe perhaps we're just a branch on a big tree with a lot of other branches. That's a great idea. What else? I've just put you to sleep.
Specialists in here and raise X amount of money. What you have laid out for us is that each of us innately has the ability to go into a food situation, whether we're aware of it or not, and to interact with people in a way that's meaningful. And so the apparatus and specialists and experts, it doesn't apply. You have a conversation with people who start in an elevator.
Yeah, you just...
So you take advantage of what's given to you rather than go, okay, well, you know, we'll form a subcommittee and subcommittee will have subcommittee, and then we'll figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And I find that message and that encouragement, one, I sat and I listened and I went, wow, yeah, of course. And the other piece of me went, that's so wonderfully freeing to know that that's just how it works.
Well, and I think it's how it works in the grand scheme of things, because we try to, you're right, we try to over-plan and over-organize ourselves. Some of you have heard me before, and I never know what stories I tell where. So if you've heard this before, just you can check out for a few minutes. One of my all-time favorite stories was I was in Africa teaching at a pastor's school in Zimbabwe. And a pastor in Zimbabwe came and gave this testimony. And he said, you know, my colleagues here know that I'm one of the only pastors in Zimbabwe that has a car. And for that reason, I serve 2 churches. And so I preach at the first service, and then I race down the one paved highway in northern Zimbabwe, in Old Mutare, to get to my other church. So he said, I was preaching a few weeks ago, and I went long in my first service. And so I was desperate to get to my next church. And so I got in the car, and I raced down the one paved highway. Well, the one paved highway that day had one police car on it that picked me up for speeding. And the policeman came and said to me, "Where are you going so fast?" And the pastor said, I looked at the policeman and said, "I'm going to church." And the policeman didn't believe me. And so the policeman asked me again, "Why are you going so fast?" And the pastor said, I said, "I'm going to church." And the policeman didn't believe me. And the policeman asked me a third time, "Where are you going so fast?" And the pastor said it was then that I pulled my sweater down to reveal my clerical collar. And it was then that the policeman believed me. But he said, "Do you know why the policeman didn't believe me the first 2 times?" And I said, "No, I have no idea." And he said, "Because in our country, you never go to church by yourself." And so the policeman didn't believe my story because I was by myself. Now, that's a really intriguing thought, was when is the last time you brought someone with you when you came here? And there's a little campaign in some of our churches I hear about on the fringes, and they've tagged it, "Everyone Bring One." Well, can you imagine? If everyone brought one, your attendance would double immediately if everyone would bring one. And it's all connected. I mean, they got to be coming to something, so that means that the music better be sharp and the sermon better be thought out, and there better be welcome personnel ready to welcome people that come in to prove what you say is really true. But it's not rocket science. It's invitational. You know someone today who needs what you have. You know somebody. Have you had the courage to start working on them, to say, I know a place of healing. I know a place of fellowship. I know that there's somebody in Simsbury today who's alone. They're just utterly alone. They have nowhere to turn. They don't have a friend. You might pass them in the grocery store and not even know it because they don't have the courage to shout to the heavens, "I'm really alone here and I wish someone would advocate for me." But that's our job, is to be looking for those persons. We heard today in cabinet meeting about a church that is not doing very well. And the word came that they have no interest in doing anything except serving the people who come to their church. They just have no interest in being invitational at all. And it's again not rocket science. That the answer as well as I do. You know why they're having a hard time. You know why they're dying. They're only serving themselves, and they have no vision about what's out there. So last Sunday I preached on the cruise ship. It was a cruise, by the way. It was kind of nice. So so last week I preached on the cruise, and I used a very simple illustration that I'd use with you. The five of you, stand up. Now you were there, so you can't cheat. I need you to make a circle. Make a circle. Now that's the way we've been taught to make a circle, right? I mean, it's natural. That's a natural thing. If I'd have picked five others of you, you'd have done the very same thing, right? But what if we started making circles like that? What if that were the norm? You see, the other circle, they could see each other, but that's all they could see. But in this circle, they see you. And so it's the simple changing of our minds about what church is. Is church the place that we come to where we're only looking internally at ourselves, or are we postured as a circle? A circle is a tight-knit group. A circle is bound together. A circle is united. But it's united just the same. The only difference is the perspective has changed. And I think in my heart of hearts, that's what has to happen to all of our churches. We've got to change the rhetoric. We've got to change the why. We've got to change the way we're looking, and we've got to change where we're looking. Yes, ma'am. Give me your name.
Lori.
Hi, Lori.
So I'm going to try not to be political, but it's going to be hard with what I'm going to say.
Okay, it's fine. You're among friends.
How do I love what you're saying. I totally agree with what you're saying. How do we, and I agree that both political parties are right. But I also believe that at the top, there's an issue that
Mhm.
nobody's addressing.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's addressing.
And no one really knows how to address it.
Yeah. So what do we do? And I don't care what side it is. I mean, anybody who's nasty. How do we deal with that?
Well, you know, I guess, and I guess this is a real spontaneous answer. I think, number one, you commit yourself to voting. Which part of the problem that happened during the last election was a big block of people didn't vote. You vote. And the second thing is we're studying a book right now in the cabinet that our pastors are going to be talking about the day after tomorrow called The Anatomy of Peace. And the real essence of that book, The Anatomy of Peace, is the confrontation of this concept. Do you approach conflict with a heart at war or a heart at peace? Right, right. But the real issue is maintaining our heart of peace, even in the midst of conflict. And the whole essence of the book is when your heart is at war, you don't deal with conflict very well at all because it becomes confrontational. But when you deal with it with a heart of peace, then you're able to maintain your posture even when there's adversarial forces around you. And it's a really good concept to really dive into and think about. But here's where I'm going with that. If you noticed, before the presidential debates took place, there were the primary debates. And if I thought it was very interesting that there was you'd hear the primary debates, and then the commentators were saying, I can't believe how that turned out. That was terrible. That was awful. And they were really referring to the nastiness of those debates. And then I noticed, if you remember, and it seems like forever ago, that the other Republican candidates tried to play Mr. Trump's game. They tried to do exactly what he did. And he, in effect, dismantled all of the other contenders. You remember Marco Rubio trying to be sarcastic like Mr. Trump was? And he wasn't in his natural realm, and it flopped. We can't play somebody else's game. We have to learn how to play our game. And that game has to be centered with this, what I think is really important, this heart of peace. So that no matter what jabs or barbs or adversarial things come our way, we're still going to know what our why is, and we're still going to live out of it. So we're going to be the best at what we're called to be, not try to be something that we're not. And so, you know, I think the problem is we find ourselves, and that's what's happening, I think, in the political realm, is that now we really are in a country, we're not in a country with two parties, we're really in two countries that each have a party. Now you think about that. That's really what's happening, because every vote that's taken is right here. My side versus your side. And if my side has a couple more people than your side, we win and you lose. Now that's the posture. I never thought I ever wanted to run for president until recently, and I'd like to run for president. For one reason, and it's a silly reason. I'd like to deliver the State of the Union address. And what I would do if I had the chance of delivering the State of the Union address is I would take a chair and I'd set it right in the aisle. And I would say, I'm not going to speak anymore until some of you over here go over here and sit. And some of you over here go over here and sit. And then we're going to have a conversation together about what it means to lead. Leading isn't about winning and losing. Leading is about gaining a sense of respect and integrity that enables us to be what we're supposed to be. A land of the free and home of the brave. A place, I loved what the governor of New York said it the other day. I really was surprised. He said, we're not red and blue. We're red, white, and blue. Oh, that was a nice line. But you know, right now we are one versus the other. And when that happens in a church, forget about it. I mean, you just put the political side, there are politics in the church. But if we ever have a posture where we have a winning vote and a losing vote, then we're in trouble. Because that means we as a church have replicated a model that we really don't read about in the Gospels. The model that we read about in the Gospels is they dropped their nets and followed him. The model is about consensus. It's not about winning and losing. It's about we don't always get our way, but it's okay. It's okay because we know that God's far more in charge than we are. My second favorite Bible verse is, our God is able to do exceedingly abundantly more than any of us can ever dream of or imagine. Which is to say, when you give it over to God, there's something a little bit more wonderful about this because God's got a greater idea than we do. And our job is to try to get in alignment with that. But it does require a real centeredness, and I think that's another way of describing the spiritual journey. How is it with your soul? Kind of conversation. Is your soul at rest? Are you resting in the comfort that even though you fall short of the mark, you serve a God who loves you anyway? That's grace. And that sense of spiritual centering enables us to lead out there in the midst of all that crap. So really, for me, and this is a really hard thing for me at times, for me the real issue is not what's happening out there. The real issue is what's happening in here. And if I got this right, then I'm going to be able to deal with that out there far better. So that may be a feeble answer, but that's my best attempt. What else? Yes, ma'am. Give me your name. Oh, Lori. Lori again. Wow, nice, nice. How many Loris in the house?
So when you were talking about, one side and the other side, you probably would never vote
Sure. I would love to say that the United Methodist Church is having more impact on the culture than the culture is having on us. But it doesn't work that way. Our church is a microcosm of the culture. We're taking our lead from the culture, not leading the culture to change. And so the very same things I've just described are what's lining up in February. Winners and losers, my side, your side. Do I have more votes than they do? And it's perilous. Because frankly, when we're in that venue, and I've been in that venue for the last 42 years. I first went to General Conference when I was as a youth delegate in 1976. And I've been there every 4 years since. So I've seen it in its best forms, and I've seen it in its most ugly forms. And that venue has gotten to be very reflective of the culture. And what that means is that there's not good listening. There's loud speaking, but not good listening.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm aware that not everyone in the room may be aware of what Lori is aware of, and so they may not know necessarily what's happening.
Okay. No, that's fine. So the dynamic is complicated. because how do we influence good discernment rather than influencing a decision? That's a big difference. So what's happening in February, if you're unaware, is that our church has been dealing with divergent positions or theologies, and most especially around the matter of human sexuality. And so the church was at a real crisis point in the middle of one of those general conference meetings in Portland, Oregon. And there was a motion made that the Council of Bishops, and by the way, when you're a bishop, people oftentimes say to me, "Bishop, what are you going to do about that?" And what they don't realize is that when you're elected a bishop, you lose a lot of your power. I don't have any vote at a general church meeting. A bishop has no vote. A bishop has no voice at that meeting. We're fondly referred to as the potted plants at General Conference, which is very different than our Episcopalian friends who have a house of bishops where they do have a vote. We have no vote. Our job is presidential. And so the only thing that a bishop does at a General Conference is preside over the body. And that's a very important role because our job is to try to keep the body flowing toward making a decision. And we've pretty well failed at that the last couple times. But it's all coming to a head. So there are three, there's been a special commission that's been formed called the Commission on the Way Forward. And the commission has come back with 2 proposals, and then a third one was added. And so there are 3 proposals on the table for a special called session of General Conference in February in St. Louis. And I am completely immersed in that work because I'm in charge of training the presiders, of which I might be one. And that's a very aggressive thing that we've initiated. I'm also working with the committee on agenda that's going to set the course for how this is talked about. And I'm on the big commission that's planning the whole shebang. So my life is just really co-opted by that stuff. The 3 proposals are basically, one is called the Conference Connectional Plan, which has we have a Supreme Court in the church called the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council just met to rule on the 3 proposals. They refused to touch the Conference Connectional model. It's very complicated, and it has so many implications that even our Judicial Council refused to bring it up and talk about it, which means it doesn't really stand a chance. And what it basically does is to say if Simsbury is a moderate church and you want to be a part of a moderate denomination, then you align yourself with the moderate Methodists. And if you're progressive, you align yourselves with the other progressive churches. And if you're conservative, you align yourself with the conservatives. So it basically splits the denomination into 3s. And it's so complicated, I don't think it will stand a chance. There is a proposal called the Traditionalist Plan. And the Traditionalist Plan really got dealt a blow by the Judicial Council because much of it was just ruled unconstitutional. So I'm sure that the parties at work are going to be reframing the Traditionalist Plan around a different set of things that might be constitutional. Much of what was determined to be unconstitutional are punitive measures. If you don't follow a certain rubric, then you will be punished with this punishment. And that does not exist in our Book of Discipline. Our Book of Discipline has a process for dealing with indiscretion, but it doesn't deal out sentencing. And so all of the sentencing pieces of the Traditionalist Plan, if you don't sign on the dotted line, you're not welcome here anymore. Whether you're a bishop or a pastor or a layperson, if you don't sign on the dotted line and comply, you're not welcome here anymore. So that one's going to get reworked. And the Judicial Council decision is just fresh. So I haven't yet digested all of that. The one that the bishops are promoting is called the One Church Plan. And the One Church Plan basically gives every congregation the opportunity to live out of its context, out of its life. So that if this is a church that feels comfortable with allowing same-gender marriages to take place, you're permitted to do that. If the church doesn't feel comfortable with that, you don't have to. So you live out of your context, realizing we're all on a journey to try to figure out, what really is God's will. And it is a permission giving. And, you got to realize we are 12 million people in Africa, which has to deal with issues of polygamy, for example, and Europe, which has to deal with the decline of the church that's accelerated far greater than we've had to deal with, and the Philippines, which is a place of great political turmoil right now, and then the United States. And to think that we can all do church the very same way is really kind of crazy, because we don't. And there's a real movement in the church for conformity. Everybody needs to conform to exactly the same thing. I don't subscribe to that. And so the One Church Plan speaks to me because it looks at a church like Simsbury and it says to you, who are you? And what is your context? And how do you feel led to do ministry? Do it. Do it. Without pointing the finger at a sister church down the road that may make a decision to do it a little bit different than you do. I had a seminary professor, my American Christianity professor, Dr. Stuart Henry. And Dr. Henry would come into class, full suit and tie, white shirt, 8 o'clock class. He would start class promptly at 8 o'clock. If you walked in at 8:01, he would stop in mid-sentence and follow you with his eyes until you were seated. He was a very defined person. So we brash seminary students decided for Christmas that year we were going to get Dr. Henry a gift. And so we bought him 3 print dress shirts. And so we presented them during the last day of class before Christmas break. And he opened the gift and he was very gracious and he said, "This is wonderful. I've never had a class give me a gift before. This is just the nicest thing. I just have one question for you. Do you have the receipt?" And he said, "I'd like the receipt for this reason. You like print shirts. I like white shirts. We can disagree and still be friends. I'd just like to have the receipt so I could go get my white shirts." Now, that was it was 36 years ago. And I've never forgotten that. Boys and girls, he used to call us boys and girls. Boys and girls, we can disagree and still be friends. It's not about agreeing. It's about loving. And when you truly love someone, and those of you that are blessed to have a spouse may understand this pretty clearly, you can actually love someone who you don't always like. And you can put up, you learn, oh, look, there's agreement in the house. Wow. I mean, there are things that you have to swallow a little hard with if you're going to make a decision to live with your spouse for as long as you're living. There's concessions you have to make. And you don't, as a couple, you don't have to always agree in order to be married. What is required is you have to have a commitment to one another and you have to love each other. Well, it's the same for the church. We're just having a hard time figuring out how to commit ourselves to one another and love each other. So there's a lot of opposition to the one church plan. People say, oh, just kill the church. And what I find in New York and Connecticut is that it's the way we're already doing things here. That's the way we do church here. And it works. It only works when you stop pointing the finger at them over there saying if they just get their act together and do it our way, they'll be right. And instead you begin to say, how do we grow together as the children of God? How do we grow as children of God into a deeper respect for one another? You know, I have dreams sometimes, and one of my most vivid dreams is that I dream sometimes that I've died and I've gone to heaven. And I'm walking through the pearly gates, and I meet St. Peter. And St. Peter says, Tom Bickerton, we've been waiting for you. Come on in. But I just wanted to let you know, there's an entrance interview. So St. Peter walks me into this room. It's one of those rooms with no windows. It's all white, you know. And I walk in and the door shuts behind me and St. Peter's not there and I can't find the door. It kind of disappears. You've seen those kind of dream sequences. So I'm in this room with no windows and no doors and I'm just standing there. And all of a sudden Jesus appears. And Jesus says, Tom Bickerton, we've been waiting for you. I just have a few things in this entrance interview that I'd like to share with you. Tom, do you know that idea that you had back in 1984 that you thought was so great and it was so great that it was my will? Tom, it was not my will. I didn't think that was a very good idea. And do you remember that time in 1992 when you proclaimed in that sermon that this was the Word of God? Tom, it was not my word. You were off base with that. You didn't quite get that right. And over the next hour in this dream, Jesus just undresses me. In his own gracious way, he undresses me. And after an hour, I'm just in a heap on the floor. And I'm thinking, there's no way I'm getting past this entrance interview. I have failed this miserably. I have not done the will of God in ways that I was convinced was the will of God. And in that moment in my dream, when I'm just sobbing uncontrollably that I've screwed this all up and I'm not going to make it to heaven, there's this hand that comes into my vision. And it is the hand of Jesus. And Jesus says, Tom Bickerton, you didn't get it all right, but you were faithful. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of my kingdom. Now, I just quoted a piece of scripture to you. The scripture does not say, well done, good and accurate disciple. It says, well done, good and faithful servant. Well done, good and faithful servant. Doesn't mean we got it all right. It means we give it our best shot. Well, that's really, I mean, in an emotional way, that's kind of the way I describe the one church plan. It's about churches learning how to be faithful, not conforming to one thing. Now, I don't know how this is all going to turn out. I also had a professor at Duke that my New Testament professor always said to me, when you're in a Bible study and someone asks you one of those really hard biblical questions and you don't know the answer to it, don't fake it. Just have the courage to say, I don't know. And then commit yourself to going and finding out what the answer is. I don't know that I've used those three words more than I have in the last few months. How's February going to turn out? I don't know. I'm worried. I'm afraid. I love my church. I have been in the United Methodist Church since I was 3 days old. I've never worked anywhere else. I started my working life as I based shelves in a grocery store one summer. But everything else I've ever done in my life has been in the church. And I worry about it not staying together. I love what I do. I've never felt more called to anything in my life than what I do right now. And it worries me a little bit. I worry about those delegates that are coming. I worry about them not listening well to their constituency. And sometimes I worry about them listening too well to their constituency, that they don't listen to God very well. So I just encourage all of our churches to be in active prayer for February, because in a 3-day meeting, the course of the United Methodist Church could change quite a bit. And I'll have to figure out as a leader how we're going to navigate that here. So we'll see. So I'm focused on what does it mean to preside over that group. And if I'm called upon to do that, how would I do that in a way that would help them make the best decision they could make? Thanks for the question. Long answer. What else? Yes, sir. What's your name?
Oh, my name is Ed.
Hi, Ed.
You're probably thinking, oh, he was baptized here. I wasn't. My wife and I married into this church. Her family was associated with it. You know, in that 30-year period of time, I've seen half a dozen, 7 different pastors within the church, all with different gifts and graces, and maintain a relationship with some of them because they have such a great heart. But just as we're seeing a decline in attendance in those churches, we're also having an issue with, I guess, what we call bench strength. New ministers,
Oh.
new people coming
Wow.
into their visits.
That doesn't mean you're a Red Sox fan, does it? How about bench stroke? Congratulations.
I'm a little tired because of it.
Yeah.
But that being said, there's a number of different factors that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And while you know we've recently went through the search process, and we're very pleased with our new pastor, 15, 20 years from now, when there's a calling for him to go someplace else, you know, what's it going to be available to replace?
Good question, and you're absolutely right. Most people don't have any idea the magnitude of what Alpha and I have to deal with. And you know, I shepherd 434 congregations, about 100,000 people in New Jersey, in Manhattan, Long Island, Staten Island, Catskill, Hudson Valley, and half of Connecticut. And those churches are on all different levels, and they have all different kind of needs. I'm not shy about saying this line. There are a lot of accusations made against lay people, that lay people don't understand. And my rebuttal to that is that lay people are often right. In fact, they're more right than they're wrong. And what makes a lay person right is that you want to have a person of integrity who's serving as your pastor. You want to have someone who's going to offer you a hopeful word with some degree of creativity. You want someone that you know that when you fall and break your hip and you're in the hospital, that someone's going to come and hold your hand and offer a prayer. You want to know that when your grandchildren are born, that someone's going to put water on their head and claim and call and love that child into God's kingdom. You want to know that when your mother dies, that pastor's going to offer an inspiring word as a graceful way of saying goodbye to someone who brought you into this world. And those aren't unreal expectations. But they are difficult things for us to generate when we have a very shallow pool. And you've named it. Right. So, and I'm not trying to stroke myself when I say this, and neither am I trying to overly stroke you, but when we sent Gene to you, it was a conscious decision. And that decision is based on a very clear reality. We don't have a deep pool of pastors. We have a deep pool of pastors. We don't have a deep pool of great ones. And likewise, we don't have a deep pool of vital churches. Alfred will tell you that, and this is where I confront my district superintendents all the time. A district superintendent, by definition, is to be a district missional strategist. That's a pretty creative line, district missional strategist. You know what they end up being? They become district firemen because they put out fires. And their life is consumed. And when I was growing up and I wasn't having a very bad day, my mother would call me a grumble butt. We have a lot of grumble butt churches who chew up and spit out pastors every chance they get because someone's, when I left my last local church, the Sunday after I announced that I was leaving, I said to my congregation, I just wanted to say to you that last Sunday when I announced that I was leaving, I fulfilled a promise that I made when I came to you. And that promise was that I would make everybody in this church happy. And when I announced that I was leaving, I fulfilled that promise because the people who couldn't wait for me to leave all of a sudden got very happy. Which is to say that every congregation has someone who's going to throw their hat in the air when the announcement comes that the pastor's leaving, and someone's going to cry. But if the dominant force in a church is being a grumble butt, then they can't understand their why in relationship to the gospel. And what I'm leading up to saying is this. We have to make hard decisions in our cabinet about where we're going to send our best people. And we've made a decision we're going to send our best people to places that have potential. And our best people to places that can define their why. And we're going to send our best people to places where there's a chance that we can grow the kingdom of God. You are one of those places. Well, and he is one of those pastors. And he's young, he's bright, he's got 2 beautiful children, he's got a lovely wife, but you know what? He's going to get old. He's going to get gray hair. He's going to limp at some point. Yeah. I mean, it happens like that. I mean, I was his age just yesterday. You get that. You know that. You were too. It just happens like that. If he stays centered on his calling, he'll be a fine pastor in every decade of his ministry. It'll go by very quickly. And what you can do in this place is to love him and encourage him and hold him accountable and press him lovingly, and then allow him to do the very same thing with you. Press you, love you, encourage you, push you a little bit down the road. And when you do, the church will grow. When you enter into that kind of a partnership. Now, I don't say that to boast you up, and I don't say that to boast him up, and I don't say that to boast me up, but that's just the clear reality. We sent Gene here for a reason. You're the reason. And we determined that this was a place that needed one of the best young pastors that we have. And your statement alone just recognizes the fact that they don't grow on trees. They're few and far between, and we have to selectively, creatively, and strategically decide where we're going to put our best people. So if you get to be a grumble butt church, you may end up getting a grumble butt pastor from me at some point. But if you're pliable and you're willing to grow and you're willing to walk into God's preferred future with this man, he'll be here a long time. I have no reason to send him anywhere else. But you determine that. You will be the determiner of that. Thank you for that question. I mean, that's just a great question. Where do you think pastors come from? They come from local churches. And I was the 30th person to go into ministry from Calvary United Methodist Church in Moundsville, West Virginia. I was the 30th. I was the last. My calling happened in 1977. And that church has not called one pastor to ministry since 1977. I had the very unfortunate responsibility of being assigned as the district superintendent of my home church. And I'll never forget the day I went in there and said to them what I just said to you. I was the 30th person to go into ministry from this church. I was the last one. When did you lose the art of calling someone to ministry? What happened to you? And that church is really struggling today.
Isn't that more what's happening all over?
Well, it has happened all over, and it again it can be a part of one of the subsets of your why. None of you are bashful at all about saying to your children or your grandchildren, you ought to think about being an insurance agent, or you ought to think about being a doctor, or you ought to think about being a teacher, or you ought to think about doing such and such. How often are you saying, I think you ought to think about God's call on your life? Now, I can tell you that someone did that for me, and I thought they were nuts. I thought I was going to be an optometrist. I just wanted to help people see better by putting eyeglasses on their face. I just got my calling mixed up. It was about helping people see better, but it had nothing to do with eyeglasses. And so, my bishop in 1976, when I was a senior in high school, called me into his office. I was doing conference youth work, and I thought he wanted to talk about conference youth work, and he said, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I'm going to be an optometrist, sir. And he said, bad choice. The bishop said, bad choice. I said, what do you mean? And he said, I think God has a call on your life, Tom. And I think you need to think about it. And then he said something, and he's gone now, so I guess I talk about this a little bit more than I used to. I used to not talk about it at all, really. He said to me, you have what it takes to someday sit in that chair over there. He was pointing at his chair. And I dial forward to 2004, and I was elected a bishop. And I was going to my first bishop's retreat, and my bishop then was taking me and my wife to that retreat, and he pulled off the interstate in Carnegie, Pennsylvania. And he said, we're going to take a break. And I said, where are we going? He said, this is where Fred Wirtz lives, in the nursing home. We're going to go see Bishop Wirtz. So we walk in this nursing home, and there's Bishop Wirtz in his 90s. He was unable to be at the meeting where I was elected. There was his golden retriever, and he's sitting in that room. And I walked into that room, and that frail old 94-year-old man struggled to stand up. He stood up. He feebly walked over to me. He wrapped his arms around my neck, and he whispered in my ear, I told you so. I told you so. And there's not a day when I wake up that I don't pinch myself and thank God for an opportunity to do what I do. But it was because of people like Bishop Wirtz, and I had a guy in my church that was the lay leader. And in the Bickerton house, he went to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. No questions asked. And I didn't mind most days until the lay leader was leading the worship service when the pastor was gone. I hated those services because Charlie Ray was going to be the one that was going to lead the worship service. And at some point during that worship service, when I was 8, 9 years old, somewhere before 10, in those services, that man, that lay leader, that Charlie Ray guy, would say, we're going to ask little Tommy Bickerton to pray for us. Now, I would crawl under the pew and hide from that man. I would pretend that I was sick. I would pretend that I was asleep. But at some point when Charlie Ray, the lay leader, led the worship service, he said, we're going to ask little Tommy Bickerton to pray for us. I hated Charlie Ray. When I was appointed as the district superintendent of that area, the day I moved in, I got a message. And I went down over the hill to Reynolds Memorial Hospital and went to room 318. In 318 was a feeble old man who'd been diagnosed with cancer, who would never leave that hospital again. His name was Charlie Ray. I knelt by that man's bed, and I said to him when I was a little boy, I didn't like you very much. But I've come here today to say something to you. Thank you for teaching me how to pray. Somebody took a chance on me. And they said, you know, we think God's got a call on your life. And they wouldn't let it go. They were relentless. When I accepted my call to ministry in 1977, I went home and I thought, this will be grand and glorious. I'll announce that I'm going to go into the ministry at the Thanksgiving table, which was a big thing in the Bickerton house. Grandfather Bickerton would pray, you know, the patriarch would pray. And I was announcing that I was going into ministry. And I did. And my grandmother stood up and said, hallelujah, God, he's finally come to his senses. Somebody saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, but they wouldn't let it go. Now there's somebody, and they don't have to be a kid, they can be a young adult, or we have people going into ministry in their 50s and 60s. There's somebody that you might sense that God's working on them. What are you doing to invite them to think about that, just like you invite someone to become a doctor? We've gotten out of the disciple-making habit. We don't know how to do that. And that's the only way you grow a church is when you think about making disciples. And the only way you help me increase my pastoral pool is when you start looking around thinking that God's got their eye on somebody and we need to help them see that. And that's the only way it happens. And so there are churches that do that very well, and there are churches that don't do it at all. And we've gotten into a bad cycle where one of the bad cycles, and I'll just be honest with you, I can be in a pastor's meeting and I can talk about evangelism and I can talk about preaching and I can talk about church administration and stewardship, and there's not one person going to raise their hand. But when I start talking about pensions and health care, got a question, Bishop? The driver is misguided. It's not about pensions and health care. It's about servanthood. And, you know, we've got to deepen our pool of commitment. And it just, you know, in my pastoral ministry, I never had any trouble making a budget. Never. And I didn't harp on it. What I harped on was grace and love and joy and widening the circle and blessing the community. And when that word got out that this was a place that would love me for who I am, when word got out that this was a place where people were growing in joy and people longed for it, guess what? Wasn't long before the pews were filled, and guess what? Wasn't long before the budget was met. So we have churches and pastors who go about it the wrong way. They go about it thinking we got to meet the budget, we got to fill out all the forms, we got to do all this stuff just the right way, and if we do it the right way, it's going to work. That's not the way it works. That's just a little branch on the tree. The way it works is when we love each other. And so when this pastor makes a connection with you, you fall in love with him. And he falls in love with you. And all of a sudden there's a good feeling in the house. We were in a cabinet meeting today, and we heard one of our superintendents confess that he was the pastor of the church where his future mother-in-law was a member. And at some point he said, I'd just like for someone to tell me something positive about what I do here. And his future mother-in-law said, I'd love to, but I just can't. and he said it was just such a terrible thing. But he said, you know, that was the way she was groomed. She couldn't find a way to say something positive without putting something negative on it first. And that's the way a lot of church folks are. I mean, there are some folks that just can't find a way to celebrate the fact that something good is happening, because we always got to find something wrong. Well, you don't have to always find something wrong. You celebrate what's right, and then you fix the things that are wrong. And so, we're all a work in progress, and we're growing disciples, we're growing pastors, we're growing churches, and it's all a part of that big why that we're all about. So you've raised a real important thing, and you're absolutely right. We have a very shallow pool, and I worry about it, to be honest with you.
I think one of the things that our society, our president, is fixated with walls. And I think many of us live comfortably within certain walls. I think the walls of the church have to be pushed out and opened up.
Yep.
I was at a house party the other night, and this particular family belongs to a mega Baptist church in the community just south of us. And they have a number of satellite locations, even more all across the street. There's one place where they have gatherings, the coffee shop, next to the grocery store, there's another one, and then some family things. This goes to the bench strength a little bit too, because we only have one pastor here. But if we had an associate pastor that could help build an alternative scenario, we interviewed Gene, we talked about his Bible and buds or beers or something along those lines. Maybe we should be doing something like that as an alternative.
Bible, buds, and beers. Yeah, something like that.
Well, maybe I made that
Yeah,
up.
I like that. No, you're not far off. You're really not far off. I know him a little bit, so I know what his gig is.
But I just, the walls of the church, I think, sometimes are overwhelming to some people. And they're the same people that would benefit the most. So if we could find an alternative location to meet some of those needs for some of those people.
Now, that's what you need to start thinking about. There are places that call that fresh expressions. And that's a movement. There is a quote-unquote fresh expressions movement.
I used to get in trouble when I had fresh expression.
Yeah, well, okay. All right, well, maybe you and I need to chat a little bit afterwards about that. The days of us opening the doors and people just coming in are gone. They're gone. They're gone. Now it's got to the point that even if you open the doors and invite people to come, people are reluctant to come. So, the church has to learn how to go to people rather than expecting people to come to it. And it's really hard for the church to do that. I find it to be one of the hardest dilemmas that any church can undertake is that. And so there's 2 or 3 things that you've mentioned that are just really important in a new expression of your why. Gene and I have talked about one of the things. Gene was in a meeting a couple months ago, where I initiated a conversation about coaching and a need to develop an intern program. We have a lot of young pastors who are going through seminary who come out of seminary and they get disillusioned because what the cloudy world, the vision of the clouds and utopia that they learn in seminary is quickly torn apart when they come to a church where there's pews and a hymnal and a bulletin and no creativity and no interest in developing it. And they get disillusioned. And so there's a gap between what they're learning and what they're experiencing. And we need, in the New York Annual Conference, to increase our interning program, to have young potential pastors come to a place like Simsbury for the summer, housed at a couple of your homes for the summer, fed by you people, given a small stipend, and able to follow Gene and Deb as they do their work. And it helps to make a connection. And Gene's talked to me about Simsbury potentially being one of those places that would welcome an intern. And I think you have to develop a feeder system. It used to be that associate pastors were a norm. Well, now they're pretty much a lost art, and I think we've got to redevelop that in the sense that there are young pastors who need to have an opportunity to grow into ministry. And they bring a sense of creativity that will take the church in places that it wouldn't normally go, which leads to the second thing. And that is that successful churches today are satelliting themselves all over the place. They're creating many churches in a variety of different settings. And they're basically going out to a storefront, or they're going out to a bar, or they're going out to, any place, pitching a tent, and they're doing a fresh expression. That's how you grow church in the 21st century. I take my ordinands, my elder ordinands, to England with me every year. And one of the things I do with my ordinands is we walk in John Wesley's footsteps, but every night we go to a pub. And I want my ordinands to see me in action. I'm not afraid to talk to anybody. I take them to a pub. They drink beer. I buy them a beer. I drink a cider. And we start to look at ways in which we can engage in conversation in an alternative setting. We've got to open the eyes of what it means to go to where people are. Sometimes it happens in an elevator that gets stuck. You just got to be ready to be who you are in an alternative setting. And those are the places where there's life and where there's opportunity. One of my favorite stories of all time is that I had a very affluent church in western Pennsylvania, in a place called Fox Chapel, very affluent neighborhood. This church had never really grown because it catered to the affluence rather than finding its mission. And so I sent a very young pastor there, and a great guy. And Tom called me one day and said, "Bishop, I want you to come and have lunch with my leaders." And so I said, "Okay, I'll come." And I did. And we had lunch, and I thought, this is going to be a standard, because I've been in that church a few times. This is going to be a standard kind of time. And when we got done, Tom said, "Bishop, we've invited you to lunch, not because we want to have a conversation with you here, but we want to take you and show you what we're thinking about." So we got into a couple vans, and we went down over the hill to a former steel community that was at the base of Fox Chapel, right along the Allegheny River. And Tom, we got out of the car, we parked the vans right across the street from an abandoned United Methodist Church. And Tom said, "We've been thinking about ministry in New Brighton. And what we would like to do with you today is we'd like for you to walk with us on a prayer walk." And so we started walking the streets. We came to a Catholic church. We stopped there. We prayed for the people of that Catholic church. We walked down a street. There were some people sitting on a porch in a poor neighborhood. We struck up a conversation with them, offered to have prayer with them. We walked by a senior citizens high-rise. We stopped and had prayer for the senior citizens in the high-rise. We came to downtown, and we were at a red light. And I turned around and I looked, and there was a storefront right on the corner. Great location. I said, "Tom, there's your place." It was a karate studio. And Tom said, "Yeah, we've looked at that. We've seen that. That's prime space. But the karate class is in there." And so we prayed there on the corner about the ministries, the various businesses that were going on. Ended our way to the park. We had communion. Held hands together in a circle, had communion, and prayed for that community. And we prayed for Fox Chapel Church that they might find the way in which God was going to use them. I will swear to you that it wasn't more than 2 weeks later, Tom Parkinson called me and said the karate class left the building. And we rented it. And today on that corner, there's a vibrant after-school program. There's tutoring that takes place. On Wednesday night, there's a Bible study for the community. And on Sunday morning, their associate pastor, who's been appointed there, I had the privilege of appointing that seminary graduate as the associate. He leads worship there on Sunday, and they're growing the Church of Jesus Christ on that corner. You open yourself to the power of God, and then you step back and watch God work. And you don't try to manipulate it, but you sure do find the strength to respond to it. Now, You'll bust the seams out in this church if you can catch a vision like that, friends. Because there are places in this community where you can establish a presence. But it can't just be an idle conversation. It starts with that. But there has to be an intentional plan to develop a faith community in that place. And you'll grow this place. It'll start to snowball. All right, friends, you've been great. Thank you for having me tonight. And maybe we could make a traditional circle before we leave. Not an outward one, but let's do an inward one. And in most United Methodist churches, when I ask them to make a circle, it looks more like a pretzel than it does a circle, so that's okay. Yep. All right. I want to take a picture of this circle. That's really nice. All right, so some of you know that one of the ways I close a meeting is this way. When I was a pastor in West Virginia, it came to our attention that there was a tiny little church in a place called Terra Alta, West Virginia. And in Terra Alta, they were dying on the vine. And they struggled with their life, and they were about ready to close. And the bishop and the cabinet sent, for some reason, what became the right person. And there was a connection that happened between the church and that pastor. And they started to grow. And their life started to change. And they started to fill the pews up. And every Sunday morning, to this day, every Sunday morning at the close of that worship service, that congregation makes a circle. I'm sure it looks a little bit different than this one. And they hold hands together. And when the pastor gives the benediction and says, Amen, they raise their hands to heaven and they shout out together, Hallelujah, we're alive. And they do that because they never want to forget the fact that they almost died. And that somehow, by the grace of God, they found life. And they always, every Sunday, want to acknowledge it. So I thank you for your hospitality tonight. I thank you for listening to me and my crazy little stories. And more than that, I thank you for who you are. And I thank you for the faithful witness that you have in this place. More than that, I thank you for the faithful witness that you will have in this place. Because God is at work in your midst. And if you come listening for it, hoping for it, believing that it'll happen, God will speak to you. And God will use you in a wonderful way to be a blessing in this community. And when that happens, what we can say is to God be the glory, because we've acknowledged what we should have known all along, that God is in this place. And God hasn't given up on us yet. And that we're going to try our best to be the faithful community of Christ that will be a shining example to this world that there's a different rhetoric and a different way. Amen. Hallelujah. We're alive. Thanks, everybody.